The shovel blade was a dull gray tooth against the iron-hard earth of late autumn. It bit into the ground with a percussive shock that traveled up the hickory handle and into Elias Thorne's shoulders, a familiar ache that had become as constant as the low, sighing wind through the pines. He was digging a trench, not for a foundation or a fence, but for a fire. This was the part that people couldn't understand. Each shovelful of dark, root-laced soil felt like an act of quiet rebellion against common sense. The trench was 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, snaking away from the footprint of his small, isolated cabin for a distance of 60 feet before branching into a complex, skeletal pattern beneath the ground where the cabin floor would one day be. He worked with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, the scrape of steel on stone the only sound besides the wind and the soft panting of his dog. Silas, a rangy shepherd mix with intelligent amber eyes and fur the color of dried wheat, lay curled near the growing mound of excavated earth. He watched Elias with an unwavering patience that bordered on faith. When Elias paused to wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of a grimy glove, the dog's tail would give a single, affirming thump against the ground. He offered no judgment, only a steady, quiet presence that anchored Elias in the lonely work. Elias was 19 years old, though the set of his jaw and the weariness in his eyes made him seem older. His parents had been taken by the fever 2 winters past, leaving him with the cabin, 20 acres of unforgiving land, and a small stack of leather-bound journals filled with his father's precise, angular script and intricate, impossible diagrams. It was from these journals that the idea for the buried stove had come. A mad idea, a fool's errand, according to the nearest and loudest of his neighbors. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" The voice, gravelly and thick with certainty, belonged to Jed Abernathy. He stood at the edge of Elias's property line, his stout frame leaning against a split-rail fence, arms crossed over his chest. Abernathy had lived on this mountain for 60 years and had buried 2 wives and a son. He believed he had earned the right to dispense wisdom, solicited or not. Elias drove the shovel into the earth one more time before looking up. He straightened his back, feeling the pull in his lower spine. "Building a stove, Mr. Abernathy." Abernathy squinted, his gaze following the seemingly nonsensical path of the trench. He saw no chimney, no firebox, just a deep scar in the land. "A stove? You're digging a grave, looks like. A grave for your own wits. You can't put a fire in the ground. The earth will snuff it out. Don't you know anything?" Elias pulled a worn leather glove from his hand and ran his fingers through his sweat-damp hair. He didn't argue. He never argued. His father had taught him that words were cheap currency. Proof was the only gold that mattered. "I have a plan." "A plan?" Abernathy scoffed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near his boot. "Your father was a dreamer, Elias. Filled your head with nonsense from books. That's not how you survive a winter up here. You survive with a cord of seasoned oak, a tight roof, and the sense God gave a goose. This?" He waved a dismissive hand at the trench. "This is insanity. Wait until the ground freezes. Wait until the first real blizzard. You'll be begging for a spot by my fire." Elias simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll keep that in mind." He turned back to his work, the simple, declarative statement ending the conversation as surely as a slammed door. Abernathy muttered something under his breath about fools and orphans before turning and stomping back toward his own sensible, smoke-belching chimney visible over the rise. Elias didn't watch him go. He focused on the next shovelful. The soil was getting colder, laced with the first hints of frost that lingered in the shadows. Winter was coming. Abernathy was right about that. It was a predator, patient and inevitable, and every person on this mountain knew its power. But Elias had his father's journals, and in them he had a different kind of faith. A faith in convection, radiant heat, and the thermal mass of the earth itself. It was a quiet, meticulous faith, one he had to build with his own 2 hands, one shovelful at a time. Silas rose, stretched, and padded over to lick the sweat from Elias's hand before settling down again, a silent vote of confidence that mattered more than all the wisdom of Jed Abernathy. The work continued. Weeks bled into one another, the color palette of the world shifting from the deep greens and browns of autumn to the stark grays and whites of early winter. The project consumed him. After digging the main 60-foot channel, he excavated the labyrinth of smaller trenches beneath the cabin's footprint, a grid designed to distribute heat evenly. His hands, already calloused from farm work, became thick and hard as cured leather, splitting and bleeding in the cold air. He would come inside at dusk, his muscles screaming in protest, and tend to the wounds by the light of a kerosene lamp. He would wash them with cold water, apply a salve his mother had taught him to make from pine sap and yarrow, and wrap them in clean rags. In the morning, he would unwind the stiff, bloodied cloth and do it all again. The next phase was the stone. He hauled hundreds of flat, river-washed stones from the creek bed a half-mile away, using a crude wooden sledge he'd built himself. Each trip was a grueling testament to his resolve. He dragged the sledge through the thinning woods, the runners groaning over roots and rocks, Silas trotting alongside as a silent escort. He sorted the stones by size and thickness, his father's diagrams spread out on the ground beside him, weighted down with rocks against the insistent wind. He was building ducts, subterranean pipes that would carry the hot smoke and gases from a firebox located safely away from the cabin. He laid the largest, flattest stones on the bottom of the trenches, then carefully built up the sides, fitting each piece like a dry stone wall. The tops were wide, heavy capstones, sealed not with mortar but with a thick, sticky clay he dug from the creek bank, painstakingly mixed with sand and water to the perfect consistency. It was during this phase that others came to watch. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose kindness was as vast as her worry, would bring him stew in a covered pot, her eyes full of pity. "Elias, dear, you're working yourself to the bone," she'd say, her gaze drifting over the bizarre stone skeleton he was assembling in the dirt. "The ground freezes 4 feet deep here. This will all crack and heave by January. It's not safe." "It'll work," he'd reply, his voice quiet but firm, accepting the stew with a grateful nod. He appreciated her kindness, but her doubt was just another version of Abernathy's scorn. It was a wall of conventional wisdom he had to dig through, just like the frozen earth. His only other regular visitor was Ilara, the storekeeper's daughter. She was his age, with a quiet watchfulness that mirrored his own. When she delivered his weekly supplies, flour, salt, kerosene, she wouldn't offer advice or pity. She would simply stand for a moment, her hands tucked into the pockets of her wool coat, and observe. One afternoon, as a light snow began to dust the ground, she pointed a mittened hand toward the open journal lying beside him. "What are you reading?" she asked. Her voice was low, without the mocking edge he'd grown so used to. "My father's notes," he said, surprised into a longer sentence than usual. He was an engineer before he came here. He was always thinking about things, better ways. "What does it say?" she pressed, her curiosity genuine. He hesitated, then picked up the book, his clay-smeared fingers gentle on the brittle pages. He found the relevant passage. "It's about Roman hypocausts and Korean ondol, ways to heat a floor from beneath. My father believed you could use the earth itself as a battery, store the heat." He said a small, efficient fire, burned constantly, was better than a large, roaring one that dies out. The smoke travels through the stone ducts, heating them. The stones heat the earth around them. The earth heats the floor of the house. It's slow, but it's constant. He looked up, expecting to see the familiar glaze of disbelief in her eyes. Instead, she was looking at the intricate drawing of the trench system, her brow furrowed in concentration. So the smoke never even comes into the house? No, it vents out of a chimney stack at the far end of the long trench, uphill. The draw pulls the smoke through the whole system. She looked from the drawing to the work in front of her, then back to his face. "It's clever," she said, a simple statement of fact. It was not praise, not encouragement, just an acknowledgement. For Elias, it felt like a drink of cool water after a day of hard labor. By the first week of December, the stone ducts were complete. He spent another week burying his work, carefully backfilling the trenches, tamping the earth down, leaving the landscape almost as he had found it, save for 2 points. The first was the firebox, a stone-lined pit dug into the hillside 60 feet from the cabin, covered with a heavy iron plate. The second was the chimney, a simple stack of mortared fieldstone rising from the ground 100 feet away in the other direction, barely visible through the trees. To a stranger, it would look like the ruin of some long-forgotten structure. Inside the cabin, he laid a floor of thick slate flagstones directly onto the prepared earth. They were cold, dark, and unforgiving. Abernathy, making one last inspection tour, had laughed out loud. "Stone floors. Boy, you are determined to freeze to death, aren't you? You'll be living in a tomb, a cold, damp tomb of your own making." Elias didn't respond. He just swept the last of the dust and stone chips from the floor. The work was done. Now, all he could do was wait for the cold, and for the fire. The first true cold snap arrived overnight, a blade sent down from the north that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the oaks and left a thick, crystalline frost on everything. The air had a new weight to it, a brittle clarity that hurt to breathe. Elias saw the plumes of smoke from his neighbor's chimneys thicken, rising straight and white into the mercilessly blue sky. His own cabin remained smokeless, a cold, dead-looking box in the woods. He knew they were watching. He knew they were talking. "Poor boy's probably frozen stiff in there," they'd be saying over their morning coffee. "He'll come begging soon enough." Inside, Elias knelt before the firebox on the hill. He had laid the fire with the care of a priest preparing an altar, a base of dry tinder, a careful lattice of kindling, and then 2 small, dense logs of seasoned hickory. It was a tiny fire, barely enough to warm a small room for an hour by conventional standards. He struck a match, the sulfur flaring violently in the frigid air, and touched it to the tinder. The flame caught, a fragile yellow flower that grew slowly, hesitantly, into a steady, clean-burning fire. He closed the heavy iron door, leaving a small vent open just enough to provide a draft. Then he walked back to the cabin, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He went inside and shut the door. The air in the cabin was frigid, holding the deep, penetrating cold of the stone and earth. Silas was curled into a tight ball on the cot, shivering slightly. Elias sat in a wooden chair, pulled a blanket around his shoulders, and waited. An hour passed. Then 2. The slate floor remained as cold as a gravestone. A sliver of doubt, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced the armor of his conviction. Had Abernathy been right? Was it all a colossal, back-breaking folly? Had he spent months of his life building his own tomb? He thought of his father's confident script, the precise calculations, the unwavering belief in the principles of physics. He had trusted the journals. He had trusted his father. He must have dozed off, lulled by the silence and the cold. He was awakened by a touch on his hand. Silas was on the floor, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump. He was no longer on the cot. He was stretched out on the slate flagstones, his body relaxed, his head resting on his paws. Elias reached down and placed his bare palm flat against the stone floor. It was no longer cold. It was not hot, not even warm in the way a sun-baked rock is warm. It was something deeper, a pervasive, gentle, life-giving lack of cold. It was the temperature of blood. He pressed his hand against a different stone, a few feet away. It was the same. The chill had been driven from the foundation of the house. He stood up and walked the length of the small room in his stocking feet. The entire floor radiated a subtle, uniform warmth. It was uncanny. There was no fireplace roaring, no stove glowing red, no sound of burning wood. There was only a profound, silent, and absolute comfort. The air itself was still cool, but the radiant heat from the floor neutralized it, creating an environment that felt as natural as a mild spring day. Silas sighed contentedly and closed his eyes. Elias went to the window and looked out. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and orange. Abernathy's chimney was belching a thick column of dark smoke, a frantic, desperate effort to beat back the coming night's cold. Elias's cabin stood silent, its secret held deep within the earth. It had worked. The days that followed were a quiet vindication. The temperature outside plummeted, settling into a deep, persistent freeze. The locals layered their clothes, stuffed rags into the cracks around their doors, and kept their fires stoked high day and night, living in small bubbles of heat near their stoves, while the rest of their homes remained arctic. Elias lived in a different world. He wore a simple flannel shirt inside his cabin. He walked barefoot on his stone floor. His windows were clear of frost. He fed his little fire on the hill twice a day, a ritual that took no more than 10 minutes. The system was astonishingly efficient. The thermal mass of the earth beneath his home had become a massive, slow-release radiator. His neighbors viewed his smokeless chimney with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Abernathy stopped by, ostensibly to check on him. "You alive in there, boy?" he yelled from the yard, his breath pluming in the air. "I'm fine," Elias called back through the closed door. "You got no fire. I can see my breath out here. It's 10 degrees. You'll be an icicle by morning." Elias opened the door a crack. He stood there in his shirt sleeves. Abernathy, bundled in a thick wool coat and scarf, stared at him, dumbfounded. He saw no sign of shivering, no chattering teeth. He just saw the boy, looking calm and warm. It didn't make sense. It defied the laws of winter as he knew them. He shook his head, muttering about witchcraft, and retreated. The whispers in town grew. The boy was strange, touched in the head from grief. Or maybe he was just tougher than anyone gave him credit for, freezing in stubborn silence. No one could conceive of the truth. Ilara was the only one who seemed to understand. When she dropped off his supplies, she saw him through the window, reading at his table, and she just smiled. A small, private acknowledgement of his success. Then, the forecast began to change. The old-timers felt it in their bones. The way the wind shifted, the color of the sky at dawn, the behavior of the birds. A storm was coming. Not just a snowstorm, but a blizzard, a monster gathering its strength in the Arctic plains of Canada and churning its way south. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent warnings. Historic, unprecedented, life-threatening. People began to hoard supplies. The sound of axes splitting wood echoed across the valley from dawn till dusk. The town hunkered down, bracing for the worst. Elias prepared differently. He chopped no extra wood. He had a small, neat stack that would last him a month at his current rate of consumption. He checked his stone ducts for any obstructions. He ensured his small store of food was secure. He spent most of his time simply watching the sky, his hand resting on Silas's back, a profound sense of calm settling over him. He had not built a defense against the storm. He had built a partnership with the earth, a sanctuary that drew its strength from the very ground that would soon be buried under feet of snow. The first flakes began to fall on a Tuesday afternoon, soft and fat and lazy. By nightfall, the world had disappeared into a howling vortex of white. The great blizzard had arrived. It was a living thing, a predator made of wind and ice. The storm screamed, a high, thin shriek that worked its way through the smallest cracks in a wall, a physical assault on warmth and shelter. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero, plunged into a terrifying abyss. 10 below, 20, 30. By the second day, it reached 35 below zero. A temperature that turned exposed flesh to stone in minutes and made metal so brittle it would shatter like glass. The snow fell not down but sideways, driven by hurricane-force gusts, piling into immense drifts that buried fences, swallowed sheds, and climbed the walls of houses like a white tide. Inside Elias's cabin, there was only peace. The wind howled outside, a distant, frustrated rage, but the small structure was utterly still. The warmth from the floor was a silent, unyielding presence, a constant, radiant comfort that held the lethal cold at bay. It was not a stuffy, oppressive heat like that from an overworked wood stove. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the house. Elias fed his remote firebox in the morning and again in the evening. A brief, brutal journey through the blizzard that left him gasping, his eyebrows and beard instantly caked in ice. But the trips were short, and the sanctuary he returned to was absolute. He and Silas spent their time in quiet companionship. Elias read his father's journals, not for instruction anymore, but for connection. Silas dozed on the warm slate, occasionally stretching with a groan of pure canine contentment. On the third night of the storm, as the blizzard reached its peak fury, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. A frantic, desperate pounding on his door. Elias opened it to a wall of swirling snow and a figure so covered in ice it was barely human. It was Mrs. Gable, her face a mask of frozen tears. "Elias, please! Our chimney! It's blocked with ice. The fire's out. The baby, he's so cold." Elias didn't speak. He simply stepped aside and held the door open. Mrs. Gable stumbled in, followed by her husband, who was carrying their 2 small children, both wrapped in every blanket they owned. They stopped just inside the door, their eyes wide with disbelief. The warmth hit them like a physical blow. It was impossible. There was no fire, no stove, yet the air was mild, the floor a source of miraculous heat. "How?" Mr. Gable stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Take your boots off," Elias said quietly. "The floor is warm." They did as they were told, their movements clumsy with cold and astonishment. Mrs. Gable unwrapped the baby, whose lips were tinged with blue, and held his small, frozen feet in her hands. She began to cry, deep, shuddering sobs of relief as the life-giving warmth seeped into him. They were the first. An hour later, more came. The Miller family from down the road, their propane tank frozen solid. Then 2 elderly brothers whose woodpile had been buried under a 20-foot drift. The small cabin began to fill with the refugees of the storm. No one spoke of Elias's foolishness now. They spoke in hushed, reverent whispers, looking around the simple room as if it were a cathedral. The final arrival was the most significant. A heavy, exhausted pounding came at the door near dawn. Elias opened it to find Jed Abernathy. The old man's pride was gone, shattered by the cold. He was covered in snow, his face gaunt with fear, and in his arms he carried his 5-year-old granddaughter, wrapped in a quilt. The roof, A drift collapsed part of the roof, Abernathy rasped, his voice hoarse. The house is full of snow. We're freezing, son. We're freezing. Elias took the little girl from his arms. She was terrifyingly still, her skin like ice. He carried her inside and laid her gently on a blanket near the center of the floor, the warmest part of the house. The other families made room, a silent, solemn circle. Alara and her parents had arrived sometime in the night. She came forward with a warm cloth and began to gently chafe the child's hands and feet. Slowly, miraculously, the girl began to stir. Color returned to her cheeks. She whimpered, then opened her eyes. After a few minutes, she sat up, looking around at the strange faces in the warm, quiet room. She looked down at her feet, still encased in thick, frozen boots. With the simple, direct logic of a child, she pulled them off, then her wet socks. She placed her bare feet flat on the gray slate. A look of profound surprise and delight crossed her face. She wiggled her toes. She stood up and took a tentative step, then another. While the most savage blizzard in a century raged outside, reducing the world to a maelstrom of ice and wind at 35 degrees below zero, the child of the man who had mocked Elias most relentlessly began to play. She took small, happy steps across the warm stone floor, her bare feet a stark, unbelievable contrast to the lethal reality just beyond the walls. Jed Abernathy watched, his face streaked with melting ice and tears, his 60 years of certainty crumbling into dust. He looked at Elias, who was quietly adding a log to a visitor's lantern. The boy didn't look triumphant, he just looked content. The buried stove, born of a dead man's dreams and a young man's stubborn labor, had become an ark. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, it revealed a world transformed, a landscape of sweeping, alien beauty and devastating ruin. The sun shone on a world buried in silence and snow. The people in Elias's cabin emerged like survivors from a tomb, blinking in the bright, cold light. They returned to homes that were frozen, damaged, and in some cases, destroyed. The blizzard had taken a toll. 2 men who had tried to check on their livestock were found frozen solid, 100 yards from their own back doors. But the 15 souls who had taken refuge in Elias's cabin were alive. They had survived, not by fighting the cold, but by living within a pocket of warmth drawn from the earth itself. The story of the warm cabin spread through the valley like a slow-moving thaw. It was no longer the tale of Elias's folly. It was now Elias's miracle. The narrative had shifted, the community's bedrock of conventional wisdom fractured by the undeniable truth of survival. A week after the storm, Jed Abernathy appeared at Elias's door. He held his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the ground. He was a man humbled not just by the storm, but by the quiet, unarguable success of the boy he had ridiculed. "I was wrong, son," Abernathy said, the words coming out rough and unused. "Everything I said, I was a fool." Elias simply nodded, waiting. "My house, the damage is bad. It'll have to be rebuilt. Before I do," he finally lifted his eyes to meet Elias's. Can you show me? The journals, the stove. I want to learn." It was the ultimate concession, the final surrender of proud ignorance to proven wisdom. Elias didn't smile or gloat. He felt no sense of victory, only a quiet rightness. He stepped back from the door and gestured for Abernathy to come inside. He retrieved his father's journals from the small shelf and laid them on the table. For the rest of the afternoon, he sat with his former tormentor, patiently explaining the diagrams, the principles of airflow, thermal mass, and heat exchange. He was sharing not just a design, but a philosophy. That spring, a new kind of work began on the mountain. As people repaired and rebuilt, They did so with a new design in mind. Elias, once the town eccentric, became its most sought-after consultant. He never took money for his help. He simply shared his father's knowledge freely, believing it was not his to own. He walked from homestead to homestead, supervising the digging of new trenches, advising on the selection of stones, helping mix the clay mortar. The work was communal. Families helped their neighbors. A barn-raising spirit applied to this new subterranean architecture. The grueling physical labor that Elias had once endured alone was now a shared burden, lightened by many hands and a common purpose. Ilara was often by his side. She had a keen, practical mind and quickly grasped the engineering principles. She helped him copy his father's diagrams onto fresh paper so they could be shared more easily. They worked together in a comfortable silence, a deep understanding flowing between them that required few words. Theirs was a bond forged not in conversation, but in shared observation and mutual respect. In the quiet moments between measuring trench depths and fitting capstones, a future began to take shape for them, as solid and dependable as the systems they were building. The winter of the Great Blizzard became a landmark, a new point of reference in the town's history. People spoke of before the storm and after the stove. Within 5 years, nearly every home in the valley had its own buried stove. The forests grew thicker as the demand for massive cords of firewood dwindled. The winter air was cleaner, the constant haze of wood smoke gone. The community became safer, more resilient, forever changed by the quiet orphan who had listened to the wisdom of the dead and the earth. Elias's innovation had become their salvation. Decades passed like seasons. The dark hair on Elias's head turned the color of frost, and lines of quiet wisdom etched themselves around his eyes. He and Ilara had married in the spring after the first stoves were built, their wedding a simple affair, attended by the entire grateful community. They raised 3 children in the small cabin, which they eventually expanded, always keeping the warm slate floor at its heart. The cabin was a place of pilgrimage for engineers and architects from distant cities who came to study the elegant, simple technology that had made the valley famous. Elias would greet them all with the same quiet humility, walking them through the principles as if explaining how to plant a garden. He never saw it as a revolutionary invention, only as a sensible way to live in harmony with the world. Silas, his faithful companion, lived a long and happy life, much of it spent snoozing on the warm floor. One autumn morning, when the dog was 16 years old, Elias found him lying in his favorite spot by the hearth, having passed peacefully in his sleep. His body was still warm from the stones beneath him. Elias wrapped him in a soft wool blanket and buried him beneath the tall pine tree where he had so often waited patiently for the work to be done. He carved a simple stone marker, Silas, a good witness. Elias grew into the role of the town elder, the quiet patriarch of a community he had inadvertently saved. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. He taught his grandchildren how to read the weather in the clouds and the trees, how to tend the small, efficient fires, and how to listen to the earth. He was a living link to the past, to the hard-won knowledge that had transformed their lives. His father's journals, their pages now soft and translucent with age, were kept in a carefully crafted wooden box in the town hall, a foundational text for their unique way of life. One cold winter's night, when Elias was 87 years old, he sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching the snow fall softly outside. The house was quiet. Ilara had passed 3 years prior, and his children were grown with families of their own. He was not lonely. The house itself felt like a companion, its gentle, radiant warmth a constant presence he had created and nurtured for nearly 70 years. He felt a familiar, pleasant weariness settle over him, the kind that comes after a long day of good work. He closed his eyes, the silence of the warm room a perfect counterpoint to the silent falling snow. He drifted off to sleep, his breathing slowing until it finally, peacefully, stopped. They found him in the morning, a faint, contented smile on his face. He looked as if he were merely resting. The town mourned him not with loud grief, but with a profound, quiet respect. They buried him on the hill beside Alara, overlooking the valley he had made safe. His gravestone was carved from the same gray slate that made up his cabin floor. The townspeople debated what to write. What words could possibly encapsulate the magnitude of his life and his gift to them? In the end, they chose the simplest truth, a phrase suggested by Jed Abernathy's great-grandson. The epitaph was just 5 words, carved deep into the stone. Elias Thorne, he kept us warm. Years later, on the coldest winter nights, visitors flying over the remote valley would see a strange and beautiful sight. They would see no thick plumes of smoke rising from the chimneys. Instead, they would see dozens of small, mysterious columns of white vapor rising directly from the snow-covered ground, faint plumes of steam marking the exhaust vents of the buried stoves. It was a testament to a quiet man, a faithful dog, and an idea that had been dismissed as insanity. It was the legacy of a boy who had listened to his father's dreams, trusted his own hands, and found a way to draw life and warmth from the cold, unforgiving earth. His innovation stood, not as a monument of stone and steel, but as a living, breathing network of warmth that held a community safe in its gentle, invisible embrace.